Welcome to the Life Given Podcast, a Christian's guide to current events conversations. I'm Isaac Lopez. Welcome to the Midweek Sprint. And you may be wondering to yourself, why is this called the Midweek Sprint? As you may know, this is Wednesday, or it will be uploaded on Wednesday. And the reason that I'm doing this is probably due to the fact that you have been looking with growing alarm at the podcast timestamps. The last few episodes, they've grown from 15 to 20 minutes up to an hour and 22 minutes. Now, I will confess that last week was an anomaly, and I've been thinking about and trying to get back to the initial purpose of this podcast, and that was to have a shorter form of podcasts, a more bite-sized chunk, if you will. And honestly, when I first started out, I would never have imagined doing an hour and a half long podcast. So I thought that would be cool, but not necessarily what the goal of this podcast was for. But all of that being said, last week was one of those things that I just had to try out. Just had to see how it would work and if I could do it. But the reason that the main reason behind that, the reason why it grew so much to be such a longer podcast episode was just the fact that there's so much to talk about. I had so much on my mind that I've been wrestling with for 2 or 3 weeks, 4 weeks, and I'd been wanting to do an episode like that for a very for a good amount of time. And so last week was kind of the fulfillment of that. And I want to just ease your mind going into this. This is now what I would like to incorporate as the new schedule for the podcast. I will be releasing a midweek sprint, which will be anywhere between 15 and 20 minutes long, not nearly as long as this last one was on Saturday. I promise you it won't get that long. The midweek sprint is built off of the idea that the Apostle Paul writes about, and that is to run the race that has been put before you. And this entire podcast is about uh, your faith, my faith. What is a Christian's life supposed to look like in the light of current event, in the light of the gospel, on the stage of current events? How are we supposed to operate? And the Apostle Paul uses a wonderful analogy for life, for the life of a Christian, by running a race. It's a marathon, and each week feels kind of like a sprint. Each week is has its own different challenges, its own different hurdles, and it builds into a marathon. And so the reason I'm calling it the midweek sprint is that sometimes life just gets going really busy, and you need just a short podcast to catch up on current events, and that's what this is for. Now, the long form will be sticking around. Don't you worry if you just can't get enough of my voice, which I know that's all of you out there. Not really. If you're listening to this on Spotify, I rolled my eyes, I promise. But there is I think just some great content out there that you can't just get in 15 to 20 minutes. And that's where the interviews will be taking place. They won't be happening every week. Actually, they will be happening every other Saturday. And that is going to be called the finish line, right? Because that's right before the Sabbath rest. That's right before we're supposed to relax and rejoice in the rest that God has given us, that has been won through Christ. And I want to be able to take that opportunity to just have more content out there that you can maybe turn to when you have some more time on your hands, or if you want to take the extra step and listen into the podcast more. So that's what we will call the finish line, where normally there will be a guest on the show. And next week I'm very excited to have on a special guest for that, and you guys will get to see that, and I'll be advertising for that and pushing more information out about that well in advance, so you will get to know, and not like the night before, like the last couple weekends. So all of that being said, I'm really excited for this new format, for the midweek sprint, for the finish line, and overall just for the Life Given podcast itself. And I hope you guys enjoy it with me. So without further ado, this week, your midweek, we are going to run through at a blazing speed what just three different topics. We're going to look at the international level, what's cooking out there in the wide world, and bring it down to the national level. What is our government doing in a situation like today? And then look at locally, where hitting close to home, what's going on around you. Anyway, without further ado, let's get to it. Welcome to the Life Given podcast, the midweek sprint edition. So for this, actually, before we jump into talking about Sweden and the international segment, I just want to let you know that I'm going to try to stick to a timer, okay, just to try to keep things moving at a good clip. So right now, I am on the clock, okay, so that way you know that there's some pressure behind me to get through this material, and so I don't wax elephantly, okay. So this week, let's talk about Sweden. I mentioned it in the last episode, just kind of in passing. I wanted to spend a little bit more time on it. Not too much time, don't worry. So, Sweden, what is going on in Sweden? A lot of people have been pointing to Sweden as a lot of people in the one camp, right? I set two camps out on Saturday, and a lot of people in the one camp that says we need to be getting back to work, we need to get the economy back and running, up and running, and they point to Sweden as kind of the shining example, which Sweden isn't necessarily um, always held that status with the people that come in this camp of let's get back to running the economy up and running again. And I just wanted to take a moment to appreciate that, to appreciate this, and that is that there is so many varying things, so many different stances you can have on this issue. But I think um, that this article actually captures the just the difficulty of trying to balance, just the difficulty of trying to balance the two different camps and the two different opinions, and it's painted in such a black and white picture. You're either right or you're wrong on this issue. And I think even Sweden, although they've taken a very dramatic approach, their end goal is still the same, and I think it should be the end goal for everyone, whichever side of it you fall on. The goal is to try to get through this and get through it as quickly as possible, but also as smart as possible, because we need to be thinking outside the box. And I think Sweden did a really good job at this because they did. Despite some conflicting opinions, I think on this, they did have some form of lockdown because they banned gatherings of 50 people. This is from New York Times, by the way. They've closed high schools and some universities, urged those over 70 or otherwise at greater risk from the virus to self-isolate. And it seems like it's really easy to hear about the Sweden example and think, oh, they're able to do business as usual. No, they're not able to do business as usual. Things have had to adapt over there. People have had to adapt their businesses, and the conflict is on the numbers, because for the surrounding areas like Norway, the countries up around Sweden, they are probably the worst off, just numbers wise. Death, the case fatality rate is much higher in Sweden. But if you look at Sweden, which is comparable to Ireland, which the New York Times article alludes to, Ireland has been lauded for how it's approached and handled this entire thing. So it's really difficult to look at and just say Sweden did it right, Sweden did it wrong. I think it's a lot more nuanced than that. But all that to say, it's great to hear that a country is able to still continue business as usual, although their economy will be affected in the long run from this, even from the minimal lockdowns that they've had. So I think that Sweden ultimately is how I would like the United States government to have implemented lockdown before this, because I think it was such a dramatic thing to do, shutting like as much as they have shut down. I thought that like it the numbers are showing that it might not have been as great of a move as we thought it was. And I'll probably get to that in a later episode, but suffice it to say, I think Sweden did the right thing. And although the numbers are conflicting on it, I think they've put themselves in a best spot, like across the board, to be able to bounce back from this. And they took care of their people in the way they thought because and the people thought that they were being well taken care of. 80% of them thought that, um, according to the New York Times article, 80% of them really likes what their leadership is doing and has faith in their institutions there. Okay, so if that last segment felt rushed, I apologize. I'm just trying to make sure that I stick to a time. So we'll hopefully wrap it up a bit with this segment, because in the national segment, I want to look at Trump's three-step plan. Right? What's the summary of how is President Trump, who has been kind of painted by the media as this ogre who just can't wait to get back to work and who hates the common American and the American public's health. He doesn't think highly of it, apparently, according to the media. If you just read the mass media's take on it. And I think that this is actually way more nuanced, and that really, I don't see how you could hate Trump's plan that he has for getting us back to work and getting us back to a healthy economy, so that so that this doesn't hurt more people than it needs to. Because I still think that some form of a lockdown should take place, but I think it should look more like Sweden's. And I think the third step on this, or the second step on this, will leave us looking like what Sweden has done since the beginning. And so the national three-phase plan, you can find this anywhere. I think I found it on AP News. Um, the Trump told governors on Thursday afternoon, when this came out, I think it was a week and a half ago, uh, that he told governors that they are going to be getting to make the call. He said, "You're going to call your own shots, and we're going to be standing alongside of you." I think that's great. I think having a more nuanced approach to this, allowing states to figure out what's best for them, because Idaho is not New York, California is not Missouri. All the, like, there are just so many different things um, to consider, and not just have a blanket approach to this entire situation. So I do want to commend this approach, because I think that that's great, because the U.S. is such a large country with so many different economies and so many different climates, and so I think that's definitely uh, a good thing to have in place. So phase one, the plan recommends strict social distancing for all people in public. Gatherings larger than 10 people are to be avoided, and non-essential travel is discouraged. So basically what we're doing now, right? I mean, that's basically, we're in the heart of that right now. In phase two, people are encouraged to maximize social distancing and limit gatherings to no more than 50 people unless precautionary measures are taken. Travel could resume. So I think that this is a logical next step, and I think that's great. And the third, and that, I think that's where Sweden's at from what I've read this evening, and that's kind of where they are nationally. And phase three envisions a return to normalcy for most Americans, with a focus on identification and isolation of any new infections. I think that's great. This is not, none of this is saying that President Trump, the administration, that the U.S. as a nation is taking this lightly. And I think that that is something very important to note, and I think something that we should definitely um, uh, be praising the leadership of this country for, because it has been such a stressful time for everyone, and hopefully we can get back to work as normal. Okay, I think I did pretty well. I kept within the time limit of that segment, so you can applaud me if you want while you're at home. But I'm trying to keep to a more consistent timing. I hope that I have learned from my lesson on Saturday, and hopefully it's not too long for you. So the final segment, and this is the one that I'll probably struggle with trying to stay within 5 minutes, because I would have a tendency to rant about what this article is about. So recently, there's this article that came out from like this interview from a Harvard teacher, professor, I could be wrong, Elizabeth Bartholet, who has quite an opinion on homeschooling. And I think that that more people share this opinion than we would probably feel comfortable with. But she basically, the summation of this article is that there needs to be more regulation on homeschooling families. Okay, so homeschooling across the board leaves Miss Bartholet very, very concerned for the welfare of the children. And I quote, that The issue is, do we think that parents should have 24/7 uh, essentially, so the issue, and I quote, is, do we think that parents should have 24/7 essentially authoritarian control over their children from ages 0 to 18? I think that's dangerous, said Bartholet says. I think it's always dangerous to put powerful people in charge of the powerless and to give the powerful ones total authority. Sounds kind of like the American government. Anyway, I think that this is hilarious. This is the irony of the entire article. I think I heard someone comment on this. Some podcaster mentions that this just seems to be the whole irony of the article, because she's calling for more authoritarian uh, legislation on these families who decide to homeschool, and that um, uh, while at the same time complaining that these adults and parents have more authority over their children than they should, that it worries her. And I think that one of her other complaints is the fact that the issue is that um, one of the other complaints that she has is that these kids, if they don't attend public school, if they don't attend American schools, then they won't uh, know how to handle, being able to interact with people of opposite beliefs, of opposing beliefs and viewpoints, that they won't be accepting of, someone who may not agree with the idea of two genders, that it's a fact that there's two genders. See, I'm revealing my hand, and this is, I think that it points out an interesting issue, because a lot of states don't require some, like background checks on the parents to see if they have had enough higher education to teach their own children, and that there isn't really any regulation on, you know, enough regulation on the curriculum instilled by the parents who are homeschooling their kids, and that sometimes they can get away with basically teaching them nothing, and maybe abusing them in the process. There's this one story of a girl who worked in her father's shop, who learned how to read but didn't know how to write, something like that, and like there was just she was working basically as a slave. I that I think is one case. I've met a lot of homeschoolers. I was homeschooled myself for the majority of my high school and grade school career, but I think that that can't speak for all of the homeschoolers. Now, I think that this points out an interesting problem with homeschooling, because I loved homeschooling. I love the flexibility that came with it, but it does point out the struggle that parents can have sometimes, and they can take it really easy on their kids, and so kids can be pandered and have a very, very nonchalant education, and I think that's unfortunate. but to take but to be concerned that uh, these children won't have the right kind of ideas, or won't have the right kind of beliefs to, quote unquote, contribute to a healthy democratic society, is just silly, because there's so much that you lose by sending your kids to public schools because of the state that the public schools are in. And I'll wrap it up here in the next few minutes, and in the next minute or so. My concern is that she thinks the answer is putting the kids into public school, and I would just look around at society and ask, where has that got us? Where has got us putting our kids into public school institutions to learn from, basically, to learn under a system that doesn't acknowledge the supremacy of the Lord? And I know I had friends that were Christians that attended public school, and it's just a very difficult paradigm to be established under as a kid who, it's a very impressionable time from the years 13 to 18, and you want to put them in a place that proactively, in some cases, denies the existence of a creator. And if you don't think that's influential, I think that that's borderline delusional. Honestly, I think if you think that you can send your kids off for 8 hours a day to learn a belief system, because that basically what boils down to a completely different belief system than what you're trying to instill in them, it's going to backfire. And that's why we have such a high rate of kids leaving the faith when they go off to school and they don't have the influence of their parents to keep them grounded. Uh, and just to wrap it all up, I think that homeschooling, yes, could probably deal with some regulation, but not by the state. I think that homeschooling parents should, like, I don't know what form that regulation would take. If you're in agreement with me, shoot me some ideas because I would be interested to hear it. But I think that parents should try, if they're going to go the extra mile and homeschool their kids, which I think is an admirable goal and is something that you should strive for. If you don't have a great school around, then they should try to find and try to figure out the best way to do it, and not just um, do it leisurely. You know, they should be pushing themselves to be able to provide their kids with the best education. I know most parents do want what's best for their kids. So, if you have any ideas or thoughts on that, let me know. Get in touch with me. I'd love to hear about it. But definitely, I prefer homeschooling vastly over sending kids to public schools. So, in conclusion, I hope that you enjoyed this first edition of the Midweek Sprint. This is technically the 18th episode of the Life Given podcast, and it has been such a blast. And I would love to continue hearing more from you guys. If you like the idea, if you enjoyed the longer form podcast, then that's why we have every other Saturday, the finish line. And I hope that you will tune in for all of those episodes. But this way, we'll be producing more content. And if you haven't yet already, catch the full interview with Nate Wolf, which will be going live on Wednesday, which this podcast will be up by then. And I hope that you guys have a wonderful rest of your week and have a great Sabbath. And remember that the life that you have been given and the life that you have received includes every area of life. Why should current events be the exception? God bless.